First, let me say it was my idea. We were invited to speak separately, and it was my idea for us to speak together. So because of that, I'm going to sort of do the setup and make the opening remarks. My husband, Carroll Dunham, and I have been together since 1977, which, by my calculations, makes us now part of an alternative lifestyle, I think. We met when we were young artists in New York. We were friends for a long time before we became a couple. And although we consider ourselves very separate, we've worked not side by side, but in close proximity in many different places, many different places, many different times in our lives, ups and downs, but we have been working near each other. We've paired 11 images of each of us, and we decided that we would put images together and just kind of spontaneously see what came of that pairing. And
they're chronologically linked.
Chronologically linked. So just to start, we're starting in 1977, and the first time that Tip came to my studio to see my work, I showed him images from the black and white series. So he came to my studio to see my work before I went to his studio to see his work, but we did start our relationship and our friendship as two artists who were interested in finding out what each other, you know, what we were up to. And New York was a pretty, in the 70s, conceptual art was at the forefront. The generation, my generation that was using photography was just starting to coalesce. Everyone was working privately, and these photographs were before I understood that I had a peer group. So when I did show Tip my work for the first time, didn't quite know what I was doing. I was very self-conscious, but I felt very certain that photography was where it was at. So I was a little bit skeptical of the fact that he was painting and drawing. So now I'll...
Yeah, we were part of the same scene, I suppose, but coming to it from slightly different directions, and both doing work that presupposed a lot of interest in recent art developments and a fair amount of knowledge about it. But as Laurie said, she had found photography to be her tool, and she and the people that she was talking to tended to be fairly, if not hostile, at least doubtful about the possibility of painting being interesting. And I had made an almost perverse decision, an executive decision on my own, that I wanted to be the guy that made abstract painting. So I'm fairly sure when we met that I liked Laurie's work more than she liked my work.
That is correct.
And you can say, I mean, these are things we were both making in the late 70s. That painting is distorted. It's a very small painting on a panel. But I was trying to find a way to bring, I suppose, what you would call emotions back into a very reductive way of thinking about painting and drawing. And Laurie was working on something completely different. So for quite a while, our being involved with one another, we had a lot of conversations about art, and we went to a lot of art events together and explored the art world socially together. But our theoretical positions, or our philosophical dispositions were fairly different.
Oh, sorry. At the point that we met, it was one of those periods that we now know come and go, but essentially painting was dead. It had died again. And the people that I knew, you know, my peers, my friends were really aware of that. And Tip I knew that he had worked for both Dorothea Rockburn and Mel Bachner, and was very involved with a number of conceptual and process artists. So I was really trying to understand what he was up to in terms of making painting. So what I would tell myself was that, well, he's making painting, but he's not really a painter. It's sort of more, it's more ironic. It's more conceptual. But that was absolutely not true. I just needed to find a way to make sense out of the fact that he wasn't a photo-based or process-based or video or film or fill in the blank. I wanted him to almost be anything but a painter.
And I think one of the things that's a little strange about us trying to speak to you all simultaneously is that we've, as Laurie said, we've always worked closely because we share a home and we've had studios in the same buildings many different times and raised children together and all, but our kind of launch vectors were quite different. And it's been surprising to us, and you'll see a bit of this as we go on, the way that the influences back and forth of work, because they're really not, they're not obvious probably to anyone outside of our little world. So we're into around 1981 now.
No, my photograph is from 1979.
We're 80-ish.
And one thing that's very significant, the reason that I chose that photograph is that my first show was at Artist Space in 1979, and those pictures were dollhouse interiors in color, women in bathrooms and kitchens. They were very tiny. I printed them myself. And right after that show, I was offered a show at PS1, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I wanted to do, I've always tried to be inclusive and sort of have either a male point of view or male imagery in my photographs. So I decided that the equivalent of the 1950s housewife was the cowboy that was on television. So these figures that I used belonged to Tip and his brother. They played with them when they were kids. And he gave me a set of these things that he called the big figures. So he gave me my toys, and we went to his parents' place in Connecticut, and that's where I shot those pictures. So just to point out that the ways that we influence each other or sort of penetrate each other's work have to do with the things we give each other or the opportunities we offer to each other. And before you speak about your painting, when we put these two up, I thought it was really interesting to even see that the palettes connected in a way. I mean, that's random, but I sort of like that.
Well, again, the photographs look more like what they really are in this kind of a presentation than the paintings do. You know, that painting, again, is not very large. The time I was still struggling with my idea that abstract art was I mean, I really never doubted that abstract art was the main thing of interest in late 20th century aesthetics. And I suppose being in close proximity to Laurie's work and Laurie's ideas started to erode that position of mine a bit, but it didn't become apparent for quite some time, and that certainly wasn't the only thing that eroded it. A lot of it was just disconnects in my own thinking and my own character, I suppose. But I was trying to find ways to bring things that felt more like, I always say, like more like what it's like to have a body, to be a physical entity in the world. Things that didn't seem like they were very much of a part of the kind of abstraction I was interested in at that time. I mean, the 1980 is a kind of hinge moment for our generation. So a year or two on either side of that, there was a lot going on that I don't think Laurie or I really knew about. I didn't know that there was a whole generation of people my age who had decided to make paintings. This was 3 or 4 years before I had ever heard the name Julian Schnabel or David Sally or any. All of these are peers of mine, but I didn't know about them. I was in my own little place trying to figure it out and mostly responding to people in my mind and a handful of friends that would come to my studio. And I don't really remember Laurie and me spending a lot of time talking about each other's work back then. I mean, you might remember it differently, but you know, we would do things like go on a visit to my parents and Laurie would take pictures. And it was very sweet to me that she wanted to use these toys that had meant so much to me when I was a kid. But I didn't think about it poetically or autobiographically or however you would think. I just thought, oh, that's sort of cool. And it seemed consistent with Laurie's approach that these little cowboy figurines would be an interesting subject to her. And I frankly, I didn't really like to show Laurie my work as much because I felt bad for her that she didn't really know what to say about it. And, you know, there was a whole sort of, well, ghettoization is the wrong connotation, but a kind of compartmentalization of painting into, you know, a thing like, well, like I don't really go there, or I don't really know about that. Which always bothered me somewhat, because to me it's kind of, I mean, I chose painting because, or I always say painting chose me, really. It was a combination of my historical interests, my personality, the fact that I like to do things with my hands. I always enjoyed drawing. But it wasn't any notion that it was privileged over other things. If anything, it seemed perhaps the opposite, and that was part of its perverse interest to me. So, and I think, you know, the other thing is Laurie had begun exhibiting her work around the time of this stuff, and I was still quite a ways from that. I didn't have any sense that my work was ready for that I was still working like a real job at the time that we were doing these things. So we were in kind of different places in our lives, even though we were together. And I was happy to have my real job and not to have that all of my chips resting on my painting, because I knew I needed more time to develop it. So that's kind of where I was at the time of this.
And I remember around that time, I never had a job. I never figured that out. But I remember at the time, Tip was a layout artist at Time Magazine, and I saw Leo Castelli on television. There was an interview with him, and one of the things that really struck me that he said, this was around 1980 or 1981, he said, real artists never have jobs. So
that was a bad evening.
Yeah. So I told Tip that I'd heard Leo on television. He said real artists never had jobs, and he said, well, who do you think is going to support both of us since you've never had a job? But there was, I think what was going on was that my self-consciousness about, you know, being part of painting or talking about painting was kind of offset by Tip's sense that he wasn't part of the what we now call, you know, the annoying title of the pictures generation. But it's interesting to think how organic it all was at the time, and seeing our children make their way in the world and find people to be friends with and find their group and find their niche makes me remember how simple it seemed to meet. For instance, I had a show at Artist Space, and when Helene Weiner, the director at the time of Artist Space, decided to give me a show, she invited me over to Artist Space so that I could see the work of the secretary, who was Cindy Sherman. I showed her my little box of photographs. She showed me her box of film stills. We met Louise Lawler, who was having a show at the time, and so we would all kind of pass through each other's orbits, go to each other's openings. People would come to our home. We would have parties and drinks together. Then there was a whole coterie of painters and sculptors that I knew through Tip, but nobody had the sense that there was any sort of movement afoot. I want to say that that's not something that's in one's conscious mind, and you almost leave it to the historians or the critics to kind of point out what's going on. But you just know that there are certain contexts you want to be in and certain friendships you want to make, and I think that was an operating principle in our life, the way that we functioned. So now, the date of that photograph, my tourism photo, is 1983. Oops. And I don't know the date.
Yeah, it's about the same. I mean, these are all within a year of each other, or a year or two, all these pairs. Doesn't seem like too much of a difference after 20 years or 30 years.
Right, it's true.
I mean, this painting was the very first painting that I made on a sheet of wood that I thought was successful. And it was really the beginning of my feeling like, oh, now I sort of have traction. There's a lot for me to do. And it was the beginning of the time when I began having opportunities to show my work in galleries, and I stopped having a real job. So quite a bit changed for me.
Oh, we got married in 1983.
And we also got married,
Yeah.
which...
the year rang a bell.
Yeah, which was, as those of you who are married know, is a significant thing. But I've always very much downplayed the influence of real-world events on my art, public events or private events. You know, wars or babies, either way. I tend to think that I'm just kind of going along in my tunnel, and that my work determines its own next step. In hindsight, I see this as not at all the case, but I can't say why it should be that in the same year one gives in to the idea of marriage, one also makes a kind of important step or opens an important door in one's own work path, along one's own path. I don't know why that should be, but there it is. Art's a very complicated, you know, the relationship between what you think you're doing and what you might really be doing is always really hard to figure out in the present tense. There's a sort of 20/20 hindsight thing about it, where I can look back on things and see connections that I absolutely couldn't or wouldn't see at the time. And Laurie and I were starting to move into sort of somewhat more similar circles in terms of galleries that we worked with and people we knew. You know, things were getting a little more public. I mean, the art world was tiny then compared to what it is now, but it felt more public. So it was it was an interesting time. A lot of growth.
What I see as being significant about both of these photographs is that that's the first tourism photo I made, and we went to Greece. Tip had a show in Athens, and it was kind of a pre-wedding trip right before we got married, and we went to the Parthenon, and there was a vendor at the Parthenon selling, you know, trinkets and images of the Parthenon and these slides that he was selling, because in those days everybody took photographs and slides. And I remember that when my parents traveled, my father would always buy slides wherever he was to slip into his slideshow, because they were always better than what, and I knew what he was up to. You know, there would be one with my mother and then one really perfect one at sunset, and I knew he hadn't taken. So I was really excited when I discovered these slides, and they were faded blue from being out in the sun in the Parthenon. So this was the beginning. This trip that we took together was the beginning of this whole series with these sort of, you know, worldwide man-made monuments, and I would try to find slides that had sort of faded to a certain color, and then pair these dolls that came from Japan, these monochromatic dolls called the teenettes, with whatever color the slide was. There was a pink Stonehenge and a blue Parthenon. So this trip that we took together that was very significant for us was the beginning of a series for me. What I remember most about these paintings on wood was that Tip seemed to be working on the same painting for months and months, and I would come in and there would be one painting on a piece of wood, and then I felt like it was another painting and another painting, and I don't know what the longest period of time was that you worked on these things.
Quite some time.
Quite some time. But I remember saying, don't you think maybe instead of making 5 or 10 paintings on one piece of wood, maybe you should make 5 separate paintings or 10 separate paintings? Because it was the most labor-intensive time, the most labor-intensive period that I've ever observed in my husband's studio, and it just seemed like one piece of wood. I mean, I wish that it had occurred to me to document what was going on in these paintings, because there were a number of paintings underneath this painting and all the wood paintings. I don't know. We actually once did a written interview to go with a show of the wood paintings that was at the Scarstedt Gallery in New York, and I don't remember if we ever touched on the fact that.
Yeah, well, it's a characteristic of the work at that, my work at that time, certainly. I wanted there to be a sort of deep archaeology in every painting, and I had made I mean, both Laurie's and my work follows weird rules. It's just not always apparent. I mean, that's a big influence of the whole practice and the whole conceptual art generation on our generation. And the rules in my work at the time were kind of more non-rules. But I had a logic to what I was doing, and I followed it, and the result was these paintings that I was excited about because they didn't look like anything else I'd really seen. The thing that Laurie was saying about color, this is jumping ahead to the later 80s. I was always interested in rules of color and ways of trying to philosophize about color. When I was making those earlier paintings, the philosophy was any number of colors, any combination of colors, it's all good. And then I decided to kind of engage my own opposite and to make a series of monochromatic paintings, which I certainly don't think were entirely due to having been around Laurie working with her little T-net dolls, but I was always fascinated by this idea of color coordination. And I mean, it comes from interior decorating, which couldn't have been further from what I was thinking about as an influence. But I was extremely influenced by the whole idea of monochromatic painting. You know, Robert Ryman and early Robert Mangold, artists like that were enormous influences on me when I started to think seriously about painting. So I thought I could bring something of that logic into my own more, what I would, as you might say, kind of automatistic universe. So, and I also had gotten properly sick of painting on sheets of wood at this time. So, I mean, a lot of the changes in my work are motivated by nausea with my own sort of repetitive habits. So I would go along for a while until they seemed exhausted, and then I would try to do something that picked up maybe a somewhat less than obvious aspect of what had been in the work and bring it to the foreground. And I don't remember if exactly what, I mean, that painting of mine I think was made in 1988. I don't know exactly the year of Laurie's picture.
1987.
But
what's it say? Oh. But I think that's a place where we could really connect, was the fact that we are exactly the same age, of the same generation, and we were both profoundly influenced by the work that we saw, the people, the artists that we met when we came to New York, and we both were very committed to the idea of systems. I know it seems funny to, you know, the woman who photographed dolls would be so involved in the system, but I did make very strict rules for myself about color and what I could and could not do. And we had always looked at art together. We continued to look at art together, and I think that we were both very motivated by the ideas that we had discovered both before we were together and when we were together of the generation ahead of us. And I do also think that, you know, the life of an artist can be, you know, we have no hours. We don't have to report to work at any specific time. And I think that particularly, you know, once we had children, our lives did become far more structured. But I think for us, the systems were so important because we needed to understand what we were doing, why we were doing it, when we would do it. And I feel like that is a really important motivator and kind of overlay for both our work, the way that we both work.
Our older daughter was born in 1986. So somehow during this last interval, we started to have a family, which certainly changes, as Laurie said, it certainly changes your relationship to time. And our life, I know my work life got much more structured, much more like kind of showing up in the morning and having a day of work, which it hadn't really been like before. And I don't particularly see the influence of that in my paintings, although, I mean, I certainly didn't at the time, although the fact that I decided to work on a very organized body of things, and you know, I can see how that might have been a psychological need at the time to gain some kind of control over the chaos of having a baby around. Never thought about it really before.
Well, we used to love to work at night. I mean, that was something that we could do. We could go out. We were, you know, we definitely had friends that were, you know, club goers, mud club people, party animals, and we would go out and have dinner with friends or go to a party. And we really loved to come home, work, and then I think we watched Star Trek every night at midnight for a
Yeah,
few,
that stopped.
That stopped once. But we love this kind of schedule. So again, in 1986, everything changed when our daughter was born in terms of that. And what I did neglect to put up on the screen were a whole series of ventriloquist photos. And you know, I think my personal observation is that women artists are much more likely or willing to talk about, oh, there they are. That's a little out of sequence. Are much more willing to talk about the events of their life and the events in their work. And I felt, you know, I feel now in hindsight that I started working with these little ventriloquist figures exactly around the time that we had children. So I was, you know, in my real life moving a kid around, and in my work life moving this little dummy around that was about the size of a 3-year-old. And you know, that's what happened. The tourism pictures started when we reached a point when we could travel a lot, when we were having shows internationally, when we could afford to travel. And then the dummy pictures happened when we started to have children. There are so many connections that one can make, although in the moment, I would never have said that I was making pictures about ventriloquist dummies because I was surrounded, you know, because my friends and I were having children. It's hindsight that makes it become more apparent, or the willingness to look back.
I was, these are sculptures of Laurie's that were connected to her work with ventriloquist dummies, and this is a painting of mine from the early 90s. And I was, at that time, starting to feel that holding so-called abstraction as a value in and of itself was kind of boring and not really very, it just wasn't very important to me anymore. But I was trying to find a way out of it just through just thinking about the process of how I made my paintings. And I was getting more and more focused on the idea of shapes, and shapes defined by black outlines, which have since evolved into being real characters and personalities in my paintings. And I think I was very impressed by this foray Laurie made into sculpture and into using these ventriloquist dummies as artworks. I didn't understand at the time how much of an impact it might have been having on my thinking. I just knew that it made a lot of sense to me. And both as a metaphor and just as a sort of physical and visual fact. Because art is something, you know, you're trying to, I never would speak about art first and foremost as a form of communication, even though we artists need an audience in order for our work to be in some way complete. But I always talk about it and talk to students about it as though it's something that kind of begins and ends with you, with the person who's making it. You know, that if you're If you're connecting well with it, then that's all you can really control. If other people connect with it, even better. But that has to be seen as secondary to the fundamental connection between oneself and what one is doing. I was not a very happy camper at the time I made this painting, I don't think. I knew that there were things that were driving me nuts about my own work, and I was also aware of the kind of shifting landscape around me. The art world had gone through this enormous, I mean, nothing compared to what we've experienced since, but a sort of inflationary period followed by a big economic recession, and everything was regrouping in weird ways. We were about to have another child, so it was, yeah, it was, you know, it was one of those sort of complicated personal times.
And I think another, you know, to compare and contrast, I think that the way that Tip works is that there's a lot of, when things aren't going well in the studio, he experiences a lot of anxiety, or expresses anxiety. In the rest of his life, it's like, well, what's wrong? Well, things aren't going so well in the studio. And for me, well, until more recently, things are always going well in the studio. It's just like I have a good time when I make my work, and I can sort of, if there are struggles, I can sort of leave them there and go back to them. My anxiety is more around the reception of the work, where I think it's going, how I think it's being perceived, the kind of critical dialogue around it. And that's something that I have to say that Tip could care less about. So there was the contrast of both our personalities, that I would have an easier time in the studio. He would have a more anxious, tense time in the studio, and then he didn't care, which was great for me. He didn't care what was written. He didn't care what people were saying. He just cared about what he was making. Because I was so conscious of being part of a dialogue, or want to be part of a dialogue, I was very aware of where my work was in the diagram of things. And that's where I would experience my anxiety. So that's...
This is about the time I gave up completely on even imagining where my work was in the diagram of things.
Yeah.
Because I just saw that if I was going to continue into the pain, you know, take my original premise that I was going to explore painting and follow it where it went, it was going to go places like this. You know, I didn't have any idea how people would react to something that I made. I was starting to find it really interesting that elements of my work seemed to be taking on personalities. And I was kind of jarring to me when we did this PowerPoint at home that both of the images involve something like a character, a pair of characters in some kind of something like a moment of dialogue or a moment of contact or a moment of mutual acknowledgement. Because I certainly wasn't thinking at the time about the phenomenon of human coupling when I made these paintings. I made a series of these that had these shapes growing up out of a substrate that usually involved a representation of wood grain. It was a way of me thinking back about my earlier paintings, I suppose, in one way. But I didn't see them at the time as having very much to do with Laurie's work at all. I mean, nothing to do with Laurie's work, really. So that was an interesting thing to notice.
My perception was that these quiet, abstract paintings that he had been making for some years started to sprout faces and chattering. And I felt like suddenly the work that had been really quiet was super noisy. I was a little worried, actually. I was watching these characters emerge and actually, you know, start to take shape and have a voice. And it seemed very noisy. And I could see that there was a huge kind of sea change occurring, but it's a watery picture. But, you know, I could see that things were moving in this direction. Suits and hats and noses, and it, you know, was getting pretty wild.
Well, it didn't seem feasible. I mean, we'd be here for 3 or 4 hours if we tried to make a presentation of pictures that demonstrated the evolutionary development of each of our work in little steps. And certainly my work, based on from what you saw the last picture to this, appears to make this gigantic leap, almost out of one whole paradigm of what painting is into another. It didn't feel like that at all, and that wasn't really how it happened. It's just that in this way that evolution works, kind of blind, dumb, connecting things, trying different combinations, it began to occur to me that my work wanted me to let this kind of thing out. And I think that Laurie's work with the dummies had a lot to do with my being able to think like that something like a character or something as potentially ridiculous as this character that started to take over my paintings, that it could be serious, you know, that it could be something that was a real, kind of a vehicle for real thinking about things. I would have never let myself do such a thing even a few years earlier. But you know, things have a way of sort of backing you into a corner. Like if you accept your own premises, then certain things follow. And if you're not just going to be either a chicken or, you know, your own most vicious critic, you have to sort of let them out. Let other people be vicious critics. That's their job. So I would really say that at the time this subject matter started to take over my work, and I started to think about my paintings as embodying this kind of thing, that the connections or the openings to the sort of thinking Laurie had been involved with became much more porous. Connections were much more apparent.
I have always maintained that he brought figures into his work so that he could get me more interested in it so that I would be willing to go to his studio and talk about it.
Which worked, I think.
Yeah, worked. I started to get really interested in these figures, and I could sit longer and ask more questions, and that's kind of been a kind of semi-running joke with us, semi-serious and semi-jokey, that I've been a much bigger influence on his work than he has on my work, which is patently not true, but that's the kind of what we tell each other, tell ourselves. And so this was around 2001. The Instant Decorators series, which I showed here at Baldwin Gallery for the first time, was a result of right after 2/11 not being able to go to the studio, make work.
You mean 9/11?
What did I say?
I'm not sure what 2/11 is.
Did I say 2/11?
Something important happened on 2/11. But.
Okay, 9/11. That's interesting. I started to do things with things that I could do at home because I couldn't get to the studio. Things that I could cut out. And this is a page from a decorating book called The Instant Decorator, where you could put fabrics and things underneath a page. Kind of create your own room, and I started adding characters from sex comics and porn magazines, and cut things out of interior decorating magazines. So I just thought this would be an interesting pair.
Something Laurie's worked on all along, really, and it's been front and center in all the writing and talking about her work, has been her interest in gender as a subject. And that wasn't something that I consciously thought about until I started to allow these male-themed characters to take over my paintings. Is this working okay?
Yeah, I don't know what that.
I didn't make a philosophical decision that I wanted to make art about the subject of being a male human, but it seems to have kind of gone that way for a while. I don't know. I always think these things are so, obvious to the point of being almost embarrassingly obvious. They kind of are what they are. They were an armature for me to make paintings, and they took over my work for a long time. the particulars are probably not for this type of lecture. I actually, the first exhibition I had at the Baldwin Gallery here in Aspen was a little after I was doing all these paintings in black and white. I started to do other series where I manipulated the character and cropped him and distorted him, and more kinds of structural things started to become up front in my interest. But the basic idea of paintings driven by driven by the idea of a character that was the protagonist in the art was something that I think in large measure came from seeing Laurie's work with dummies and other things that I'd been looking at that had been a little bit outside of my interest before.
Well, I think you wanted to address gender. I remember you expressing the idea that you thought that it would be, there were a number of paintings that had these, when I talked about them chattering, these sort of chattering blonde women characters. And I think at a certain point you felt it would be interesting for...
Well, I lived through feminism just like all the ladies did,
Right.
And I didn't really see a lot of that as real subject matter, if not content, in the painting of most of my peer group. It didn't seem like something that was being examined in a really direct way, and I thought it might be important, or at least, not to make claims. I don't mean important in any, it might be important to me, is really all I mean. And that's what it felt like. You want to say anything about that?
No. I'll say something about this. There was a kind of odd series, that I'm just going back to examining. I made a movie in 2006, which really was a kind of closure on years and years of work. It was one of the biggest efforts that I've ever made. My executive producer, Jeannie Greenberg, Rowerton, is here. She made it with me, and it was like such a labor of love and so intensive, time-intensive, effort-intensive, financially overwhelming. And when the movie was done, I was sort of diminished. Everything I'd done up to that point was it seemed like I couldn't go back to anything. So I thought, well, the only way to start again is to start with just a kind of rebirth, women in no time, in no place. I started, taking pictures of naked girls downloading free porn from the internet, and I started to try to build something up from a base again. And these pictures were called color pictures. I had a booth of them, I think, at the 2007 Miami Basel Fair. And it was interesting to really, it was one of those periods of time where I was there, I installed the booth, people were coming by, people that knew my work, and I sensed that people were really confused and baffled by what I did, which was okay. It was interesting to feel that feeling of really, starting over. And so I started to embellish on the pictures. I started to cut things out. I started to paint on the naked girls. And I put this picture up because Tip happened to come into my studio, and he just absolutely fell for this picture, and I made him a print and gave it to him either for our anniversary or his birthday. But I thought it was really interesting that, I think it's Basiotis in the picture.
It is William Basiotis.
Who happens to be an artist.
Which I don't think, Laurie, you knew that.
I had no idea who it was. And actually, Tip just recently wrote a really, what I thought was a terrific piece about Basiotis for Art Forum. So this was, way prior to this. But I thought it was really funny the way he fell in love with this picture that was this classic artist model scenario. Totally a little raunchy, totally sexist. And he just really loved it. And this is, as these color pictures were kind of growing to a point, leading me up to my most recent work. The slides are, the images are coming up.
Well, it was very meaningful to me, almost in the way that I I felt like there was some sort of telepathy going on, because I had finally managed to get beyond paintings that were dominated by that male character, and was working on a whole big group of things around the idea of painting trees, not real trees, but trees I imagined. And I think I saw it as a way to get back to something less like sort of charged in a topical subject matter kind of way, where I could think more structurally again about painting. And I don't know, I'm still not quite sure how to talk about that period of time, but that's an example of one of the paintings that I made at the time that I still, I like a lot. So, but other things were kind of percolating in my head, which Laurie had no real reason to know about. One of them was the idea of painting women, of really taking on the whole idea of the nude, which runs throughout Western art history and is the premise of a lot of painting earlier painting that I love and have been very affected by. And I was having less and less able to see a reason why that shouldn't be an interesting thing to do. And I saw this photograph of Laurie's, and the fact that it was Basiotis, who's a kind of an odd artist that a lot of people don't think about now, who I have a particular interest in, and that Laurie had just kind of taken this picture from an old book or magazine based on what it looked like. She didn't even know that it was Basiotis. It seemed like there was some message there for me, reading the innards of goats or something. And so, I started doing these things. I mean, again, I can't show you the whole development. It doesn't matter for purposes of this conversation. But the last couple of years, I've been bringing my interest in painting trees and my interest in painting naked human females together. I don't paint real trees and I don't paint real females. It's all coming out of here. But it's what I'm in the middle of, and it's odd because it's this is all going together with Laurie finding her way into this whole new body of work that involves this doll that she can tell you about. But for the very first time, about 2 months ago, I was giving a lecture about my work in New York, and someone asked me why Laurie's work and my work were following in such closely related areas of subject matter. And it was absolutely the first time anyone has asked a question like that to either of us. And damned if I know, really. I mean, I think in a way it's kind of a red herring because we've come to things in such different ways. But in another way it can't be because it's so obviously connected.
Yeah, I think this is the point. I mean, the whole group of images and talking leading up to this is the point that I'm really excited about, because it's just gotten really weird that there is so much connection in the imagery, and I can't say that I saw it coming. I don't think you saw it coming. I was at the lecture where someone asked the question of what Tip had to say about the fact that our work was so closely visually tied right now. And my most recent body of work involves a Japanese love doll, a Japanese sex doll that I found in Japan in the summer of 2009. I spent most of the summer in 2009 in Japan, first having an exhibition, brought one of our daughters along, and then went back to screen my film, brought the other daughter along. So I felt, very much immersed in the culture there, as well as one can be, in a couple of months, and also that I was definitely going to find something there that was going to sort of break the malaise, the kind of doldrums that I'd been in after completing the movie. And when I found this life-size love doll, I just saw the possibilities opening up for me. And once I ordered the doll, I had the opportunity to decide everything about the doll down to the most. I mean, detail, the color of the hair, the color of the eyes, the color of the skin, all kinds of other details that I will not share with you. But the idea that around the same time, Tip started making these paintings with this woman is emerging with this wild black hair. It's just, you know, it's something I'm currently trying to make sense out of.